Hey everybody, I'm Jason Mefford and I'm back with Brad Miller and we are walking a spiritual path with you today. Again, this is one of those episodes where we're not quite sure how to describe what we want to talk about today or what we've been working on or how we're thinking about this. But I think, maybe a summary of this is connecting and having a relationship with our higher self. And again, that may sound a little weird, and I'm going to warn everybody, some of what we're going to say today may sound weird because it makes sense to us, but sometimes it's a little hard to describe to other people because that's the way that spirit actually works. We don't have knowings in the English language, or in whatever language you may speak. And so sometimes it's difficult to describe in words because words are so inadequate sometimes in what we experience, in what we know, in what we feel, right? That it's actually hard to put them in words. But one thing that has been on my mind that I've been working a lot with is, I've been distracted lately with what I call matter or things in this 3D that we're taught or we believe are important. Making money, having relationships, right? Accomplishing certain things, right?
hmm
And they're always really kind of sneaky. Sneaky, sneaky. Did you ever see the movie Mr. Deeds? Adam Sandler movie?
I don't know
Oh,
if I've seen that one.
there's a character in it, Joe or John Tarantino or something like that. Anyway, his character, he's like sneaky, sneaky, just like pop up and scare it. Anyway, just reminds me of that. But um, but yeah, these things are kind of sneaky because we're told that they're important, and yet they're absolutely not important. And so this whole idea of, we've talked about Don Juan Matus before, and one of the things that he said was, you have to uh, give a damn and not give a damn at the same time. And it's like, what? Right? It's one of those things that doesn't seem to make
hmm
sense, that a lot of times the spiritual sayings don't, right? How can I love someone so intensely and do everything I can to be in a loving relationship with this person and at the same time have no attachment, right? That
hmm
if I never see them again, that I'm okay with it, right? And so, it could be relationships, it could be, in our businesses and making money or our job or our career path. Again,
hmm
these things that we are told are important. It's important for me to make money so I can take care of my family, right? That
hmm
makes logical sense. But we didn't incarnate on this world to make money. We incarnated to remember and to connect and have relationship with our higher self and to learn and to grow and evolve, right? That's what's really important. One of
Right.
those things that we have to do is the non-attachment. And I think, for me, it's just become aware the last few weeks in particular, how I've kind of let myself get distracted. I'd go times where I'd be really good about my practices, about, you know, working on my relationship with my higher self, and then I get distracted again, right? And it's this constant pull back into not being distracted and remembering what really is the purpose of this life. And these things are put there to help us to grow, right? Because every time we get distracted, and we have to pull ourselves out of the mud, right? We're growing, we're evolving, we're getting better, we're gaining more light, we're gaining more personal power, right? All these things along the way. So, I don't know if that's made any sense so far, Brad. So,
No, yeah. I've similarly been feeling, for the last probably 3 weeks now, that I've gotten wrapped up in what we call the 3D world. So the stuff of everyday life. My daughter is in a lot of activities, sports, and different things. So there's been a lot of that. We're helping coach her softball team. So there's a lot of focus on softball and, what are we going to do for practices and what are we going, what's the weather going to be like? Are we going to be able to have a practice or how are we going to deal with that? Who's going to be there? Like things like that. Um, Stuff with the business, with my law practice, where, where's the next client coming from? What stuff do I need to be working on? Should I be doing more of this or that? Or, because like you said, we're kind of told, we're taught, or we are led that to believe that providing for our family is one of the most important things that you can do. How do you do that, generally speaking? Back in the day, it might have been, you'd go and you'd hunt and you'd bring back a deer or something like that, and that would support your family. That's how you supported it, by those actions. But now, generally, it's going out and, bringing home a paycheck. It's generating money and using that then to buy food and clothes and all that kind of stuff. And so we kind of put a lot of emphasis on that stuff. And so and that's what everyone's telling us. You watch TV or you listen to things and they're talking about stuff, all those advertising things you can buy and how it's going to make your life better. It's going to make things easier. Like, just how nice is it going to be if you have all these AI, for instance? That's a big thing right now is, all these AI tools are supposed to make your life better, you know, but is that really why we're here? It's really easy to get wrapped up in all that stuff. And that's what I've been feeling the last couple of weeks and really finally the last day or two recognize what was going on. I'm like, why I feel like, a little heavier lately. And that's why is because I've gotten into a lot of the 3D stuff. And that's kind of been a really where my mind's been is on that kind of things as opposed to some of the other practices that we've talked about. We're, I don't know, 120 or so episodes in right now. There's tons of things in there that we can do. There's tons of things that, if I'm lacking of something to do, I can pull up an episode. I can say, all right, episode 73, what do we talk about in there? Am I doing that to the best that I can? Probably not. So let me go and work on that a little bit. There's always something like that that we can be doing, but that's not where my head's been. And I mean, I'm sure that's not where most of us, our heads are either thinking about these things. But that's kind of the analogy I was kind of talking to Jason about before we started was I almost kind of feel like here I'm trying to now I realize that I'm under the water and I'm trying to swim up to the surface. Like I've been under the water, I've been, do my thing, whatever, hold my breath, whatever, snorkel, whatever. Now I want to move up and I want to get to the surface. So now I'm trying to figure out, all right, how do I paddle up? How do I get up there to the surface? What do I need to do to get up there to the light so I can take a big gulp of air or whatever. Um, so
and I think that that's actually probably a pretty good analogy to use for us because, in what we're talking about, we're not saying quit your job, don't make money, don't coach your kid's softball team, don't be in relationship with anybody, just be a complete hermit, never talk to anybody, never have any money, just be a monk. That's not what we're saying, right?
mhm,
Because again, these are all things that are part of this incarnation.
mhm,
They're tools that help us evolve on our spiritual path. But when we focus so much of our attention on these things to the neglect of our higher self, to the neglect of, maybe doing some simple practices. And again, we're not talking about like sitting down and meditating for 6 hours a day
hmm,
either, right? But it's like we come underwater, like we're holding our breath spiritually. And we're down there. And for the first little while, depending on how long you can hold your breath for, not a problem, right? But all of a sudden, it's like, I need some air. And what happens if we just stay down and we don't go back up for that spiritual air? Well, we drown, right? We
Mhm.
drown. We die spiritually. And that's a good analogy for what we're talking about. We're not saying don't dive into the deep end of the pool, don't, do these things, but make sure that you've got air to breathe, spiritually speaking,
Mhm.
that do what you need to. You rest on the side of the pool for a while, you take some big deep breaths, and then you hop back in. And you're down there for a little while, and then you pop back up and you do what you need to do. Right. Because that's one thing my benefactor is taught too, is he says, these things are not going to take away from your 9 to 5. And at first it's kind of like, well, what? Right. But it's like, no, we have things that we have to do. And there's nothing wrong with making money. There's nothing wrong with having abundance. There's nothing wrong with coaching softball. There's nothing wrong with being in relationships with people. Right. But is our sole focus there? And are we neglecting ourselves? And I think we've kind of talked about this before too, where, to be truly selfish, the words are not going to come out right. But in order for us to truly provide the benefit that we need to in this world, we have to do things that others may view as being selfish,
Mhm.
right? I need 15 minutes to go and do whatever, right? Because maybe that's your spiritual getting your breath, right? And other people may say, well, but no, right? You're my whatever. You're supposed to be with me all the time. You're supposed to only think of me, right? It's
Mhm.
selfish for you to go and do something else. Um, and so people won't understand, right, necessarily. But it's one of those things that we have to do, or else we drown in the pool.
Mhm. Yeah, and that's like I said, it's not that you shouldn't get into the pool, that you shouldn't jump in the water. I know we've used the analogy about, if you don't want to get wet, jump in the pool. This is a different analogy with water. It's fine if you want to jump in the pool and you want to experience, I mean, because that's the experience of life. That's the human experience we're here to have. The things that you're supposed to be here to experience love and caring and pain and all these other things, these human things. Like that's part of what we're here to do. Because like you said, they're tools, really, tools to help us grow. But it's in realizing that that's what they are, that they are tools, that there is more to it than just that. That there are bigger things out there that you can actually go and you know swim up to the surface, and there's a whole, as the little memory would say, a whole new world up there, um, you know, above the sea. And so that's what we're trying to get to. That's what we're trying to experience, is getting up there to experience the whole world up there that's above the ocean. Because most people spend their entire lives in the ocean, you know? And I think once you start to raise yourself closer to the surface and you can start seeing glimpses of the surface and something above the water line, you start, I don't want to say curiosity, but you start getting more wanting to go and see what's up there. You get a little peek of something up there and like, ooh, what are those shapes? What are those colors I see up there? That's totally different than what I've seen underneath this water. And so you want to kind of go up and you want to explore it and you want to check it out and you want to get more of it. And you realize, hey, I need to take a real big deep breath of this because I want to bring it down with me. Um,
Yeah, well, and it's interesting as you're talking about it because, a whole new world,
which again is
you
a different
know,
movie as
little
well. We're mixing movies, but still.
anyway, we're just switching movies, but it's what's interesting too is this water analogy, right? The density of water versus the density of air, just physically speaking, right? Is also interesting. as we're talking about this because the density, the matter, the 3D is more dense than spirit, right? Is one way of describing it. And what's interesting is, as you go into the water, and the deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper you go in the water, what happens? There's more
Mhm.
and more and more pressure, right? To where, if you go down in some of the deepest parts of the ocean, it'll actually crush a submarine, right? Because the pressure down there is so significant, right, that it just crushes whatever goes down there. And so it's interesting because I think I remember you saying at the beginning about density and heaviness, right? And so what's interesting is, when we feel more heavy, when we feel more dense, we've probably gone a lot further down in the ocean than what we may realize. And we're running out of breath and we're feeling the pressure, right? And at that point, we have a choice: stay down there, get crushed, right? Feel like we have no control, or we look up. Because what happens when you look up, right? When you're in water, you see the light. Again, not a surprising analogy, right? Holy shit,
Mhm.
right? You see the light. You start swimming towards the light, right? And what does light represent as well, right? And it's hard maybe at first, right? Because again, the pressure is so great, but the closer you get to the top, the easier it gets too,
Mhm.
right? And again, I mean, I did scuba diving one time, and I know
Sure, there's
even
a
from
picture right
like,
behind you,
yeah,
actually.
that one right there when I felt like I
Mhm.
was gonna die. Um, but also, jumping into the pool from like a high dive, right? And so you go down like 12 feet, and almost touch the bottom, because of how high you are. And again, when you first start to try to go up, it's kind of challenging at first, but as you start going, it gets easier the further up you go because again, the density of the water is less.
Mhm.
And so, again, maybe that's part of it's not about dipping your toe or getting wet a little bit, but making sure that we're not going to the depths of the 3D. We're not going to the depths of the ocean, right? That we're staying, yeah, we have to play in the pool. It's part of life, but
Mhm.
we also don't have to dive 50 feet below sea level, right? That's probably not where we want to hang out most of the time. And I think those times when I felt heavy, when I felt, a lot of that pressure, it's because I was too low in the water and I need to get back up.
Mhm.
And that's what I've been working on, you know, the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
As I
Like I said, that's
become more
something.
aware and realize, hey, some of these other things
Mhm.
is the density. And it's like, whoa, I didn't even think about that beforehand, but oh my goodness, right? Yes, it is. That is the density. And it
Mhm.
is distracting me from where I really need to be.
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, this is something that I've just it's been the past couple of days I've kind of realized that, hey, there's that weight kind of down on me that I need to try to again push my way up. And it's getting in things that again we are told as things that we're supposed to be doing that's important, that are good to do. Um, and there's nothing wrong with any of these things either. There's nothing wrong with, like you said, having money, abundance, having a job, supporting others, being relationships, all this other stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. And by all means, we should be experiencing these things. That's part of why we're here, to experience all that being a human has to offer. But the trick is not attaching to those things, not making them an anchor that brings you down. Yep, there you
There's no,
go.
there's a,
It just
there's
keeps
another good
going.
one. Oh my
It just
goodness,
keeps
yeah.
going. Yep. But not letting it be an anchor, but allowing yourself to stay up. Like I said, the more you're up towards the surface, the less the more time you spend up there where you can see the light, you feel less pressure. Um, the more time you're walking this path, I think the more you want to be up there. You want to see what's above, the water level. You want to be up there, see what's the commotion going on, what's all the colors and the lights and the things going on above the water. We've played in the water and that's great and all, but there's something else. It's not just under the sea.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah, and I think for everybody it's going to be different amounts of time and
sure.
different, points of being in the water versus being out of the water, if you will.
Hmm.
Um, and everybody's, kind of different depending on maybe how strong we are at swimming in a way.
Yep. Do we have
In
little floaties
what,
on?
yeah, well, yeah, you remember that story. No, when I went scuba diving, I had a life jacket on. Yeah, because I wasn't gonna be out there and yeah, I couldn't dive down, but I could still stick my head down into the water and actually see what was going on, right? But
Hmm.
I wasn't about to drown or feel unsafe. And so yeah, I was like the weird kid in the pool with his floaties on. But hey, whatever.
But you
Uh,
made it though. You stayed safe. That's.
I'm safe, right? And yeah, I think it's, like you said, there's a we can't spend all day on the beach above the water, right? We have to still get in the water because there's still, like you said, they're tools or things that help us learn. But we get to choose how much time we spend between the two.
Hmm.
And I think too, it's not we always talk about balance, but balance is not, I think, quite what we think it is, in that it's not 50-50 scales,
Hmm.
right? So, as an example, if I am in a pitch black room, complete darkness, right? Do I need to make 50% of that darkness light to balance to be able to see? No. I could light a lighter. I could light a little tea light. It's just a little bit of light in this whole big room of darkness. But that little bit of light helps to see everything, to illuminate what's going on, to help you when you're in that darkness, right? And so it's the same way here. We're not talking about, okay, I go to work for 8 hours a day. I need to spend 8 hours a day on my spiritual practices, and I need to sleep for 8 hours. That's a balanced day, right? That's logically how we would look at it. And we would kick ourselves if we spend less than 8 hours in a day on our spiritual work because we're not balanced at that point. But that's not what it means, right? It's sometimes in short little increments, sometimes maybe only a few seconds or a few minutes. But that couple of minutes of taking a spiritual breath may get you by for 8 hours in the pool, right?
Hmm.
And so, I think that's one of the fallacies is not to believe that balance necessarily means similar amount of time, right?
Hmm.
And that's why, again, I was told this isn't going to take from you 9 to 5, right?
Hmm.
But if our 9 to 5 turns into 16 hours a day, right, then we may think that some of these things are taking away from our 9 to 5, but it's only because we're neglecting them, and it's not a 9 to 5 anymore,
Right.
right? It's no longer a 9 to 5. And I think, that's been one of the traps that people have been put into as well, especially here in America, is in working people so much, right, that they have no time. There's a reason why there's a 40-hour work week. And there's a reason why a lot of companies now require their people to work 50 or 60 or 70 hours a week and still only pay them for 40, right? Because once you get to that point, right, all you can do is get up, brush your teeth, eat breakfast, take the kids to school, go to work, come home, make dinner, go to bed exhausted, get up, do it again, right? And so if we allow that 9 to 5 of our life, whatever it may be, whether it's a career job, whether it's your own business, uh, to creep, right? Then it will creep to the point that it excludes everything else.
Mhm.
And so I'll give you because this is a true principle. We will we will expand into, and things expand into whatever container they are given,
Mhm.
right? So a bonsai tree, right, is stunted in its growth because of the container that it is put in and because of the trimming that happens to it. If you put the same bonsai tree in a huge pot and you didn't trim it, it would grow to be something different. We take up the space that we are given. And
Mhm.
so when I worked in public accounting, we used to, we'd go around to different clients. They'd give us a place to work, usually a conference room or something like that. And what's interesting is I started to notice that we took up exactly as much room as we were given. And
Mhm.
so if we were in this huge boardroom, like with a table that would fit 20 people, and there were two of us in there for a week, what would happen? The whole table
Mhm.
would be covered with papers and other things. We would completely take over that whole conference room, right, for the two of us. Next client we go to, and I literally had this one time because they didn't want us to be there, but they
Mhm.
put a card table in the hallway by the copy machine
Awesome.
for two people. And guess what? We took up every bit of that card table too, right? So if you're given a card table or if you're given a conference room of 20 people, boardroom, you're going to take up the amount of space. And so I think that's one thing for us to learn too. And I've been getting better at this because I used to be what I would consider a workaholic. I mean, I would, whether it was my own business or in the corporate world, I would work a lot more than I needed to take up the space. Now, some of that taking up the space was because I didn't want to deal with certain things, but it's that way too, here of, you know, are you going to let your 9 to 5 take more than your 9 to 5 so you can't do the other things that are important to you, whatever
Mhm.
that is, right? I mean, if you were working 80 hours a week, Brad, would you have time to coach your girls softball team?
Mhm.
Probably not,
Yeah.
right? And so you've had to make a choice to say, hey, I only have so much time to work because I'm going to spend time doing that, right?
Mhm.
And it's the same thing if it's our spiritual practices or whatever else, right? If we don't block out the time, if we don't take some time for it, then, the 3D ends up overtaking everything.
Mhm. Yep, yep. And if there's any lawyers that are listening to this, I'm sure you guys totally understand this because this is the bane of every lawyer is, the work. And everyone's talking about how you have to work late nights and weekends and you don't actually because I don't. And so it's impossible not to. But if you allow the space to do that, surprise, surprise, the work that you have will fill in so that you have things that you need to do on the weekends and in the evenings versus if you say nope, 5 o'clock I'm done because I've got other things to do, that's the end of my day. I think you'd be surprised that you can fit in a lot of stuff in that time period, and still have the rest of your time for family or for yourself, other things that you also prioritize, sleep,
Mhm.
those things, or as the case may be for us, your spiritual practice. You have time to go out like I did this morning and go for a hike, because you are good about keeping that boundary. And I mean, we could do a whole episode on boundaries of various kinds, but that really is important that you set those, to keep other things, specifically work, from getting into other aspects of your life where maybe you don't want it.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, but it can be, because I see this happen a lot of times in relationships though too,
Mm.
right? We have a relationship with our job or our career, but we have relationships with other people too. right?
Hmm.
And sometimes those relationships want all of our time that's remaining, right? Which then again doesn't leave any time for us, right? And this is something else that, sitting with of, how are you a good whatever in a relationship when the other person expects, hey, you're not at work right now. You should be with me, you know, all the rest of the time. Because if you truly love me, then you're going to do everything and anything that I want you to do, and you're going to spend all the rest of your time with me. Well, that's not a reality. Maybe some people that's fine. For a lot of us, can't take it, right? It's not where it is. I have to have my alone time.
Hmm.
And it's easy though to get distracted and say, well, but it's important for me to be in a relationship and I want to make the person happy, right? And we do that. And I've spent most of my life pleasing people that I'm in relationships with to the exclusion of pleasing myself
Hmm.
and pleasing my higher self, right? And so that's again where sometimes we have to stop and kind of rebalance a little bit and say, well, it doesn't have to be that way.
Hmm.
And a relationship doesn't have to look that way, right? And we need to do what is in our own best interest and in the best interest of our higher self, right? In order to set some of those boundaries and do some of those things.
Hmm. So we've been talking a lot about higher self and taking care of the higher self and being and that kind of stuff. How do we meet our higher self? Is there like an app that you can go to and like, you
Oh
know,
boy.
there's some place you go to
Well,
meet
that
them?
will have to be for another episode, I guess, Brad, because yeah, I got to think about how to even try to approach that. Uh, because yeah, that's a subject we could talk about for days and days and days and days. And that
Mhm.
may be a term too that a lot of people are not so familiar with or
Right.
haven't really thought about. Um, yeah, so we'll probably have to do another episode on that one later.
Which means that you should all make sure you tune in to that episode so that we can
Mm,
explain,
mhm.
hopefully for you, provided we ever get to it, because there's no guarantees that we'll ever get back to those things that we say, we'll have to do another episode on that. And then odds are we never ever do. But
Well,
but you
because
won't
it's
know
it's
unless you
it's
keep
it's
following.
yeah, and
So
it's just whatever Spirit tells us to talk about. So
yeah.
if we're supposed to talk about it, it's going to be in a future episode. When? Don't know. It's
Hmm.
whenever it feels like we're supposed to talk about it.
Yep. So
So with that, everybody, thank you for listening. And again, I mean, we're not telling you what to do because the choice is yours. But again, hopefully some of the analogies that we talked about today with the water and the pool and going back up for air and that our spiritual practices don't have to take away from our 9 to 5 or other relationships, but maybe there are times, like Brad and I have both felt this for the last couple of weeks, where maybe we've been a little out of balance,
mhm,
and it's about kind of reprioritizing, changing, doing things a little bit different, to make sure that we're nurturing and growing and not getting so distracted, right, that we're ignoring the things that we actually need. Because
mhm,
what we're talking about is it's literally no different than eating physical food, right? If you get so distracted that you don't eat for 5 days, you're going to pass out. If you get so distracted that you don't do anything for yourself spiritually for 5 days, you're going to pass out spiritually, right? It's
mhm,
it's that important, for us to do. But a lot of times, we don't realize. It's just like if you haven't eaten for 5 days, you don't understand why do I not feel well? Unless you go, hold it, I haven't eaten in 5 days, right?
mhm,
But a lot of us, it's that way for us spiritually. We don't even realize, why do I feel so heavy? Why am I getting so angry? Why am I, well, maybe you haven't been eating your spiritual food for a little while too, right? And maybe it's time to have a nice little feast. or
Hmm.
at least a little snack to get you by, like the Snickers commercials, right? Here,
Yeah.
have a
You're not
Snickers.
yourself without, yeah.
Yeah, you're not yourself. So, so with that, everybody, thanks for listening. We will see you on the next episode.
See you later.